Justice Marshal BraveStarr.
Back in the 80s, life was very different. There was no internet in everyone's pocket or a smartphone glued to our hands. Computers did exist, but compared to the sleek monster laptops, they looked like a square box. There was no Siri or Alexa to turn to, but you always had to turn the radio on for songs. If you were fancy, you had a Walkman or maybe a boombox. So what I want to say is that the 1980s were a far less technology-driven time. Heroes were pure heroes and villains were as ruthless as they come. And oh, a moral lesson came at the end of pretty much every episode. So whenever I look back at TV from the 80s and 90s, one thought always comes to mind is that man, they do not make this stuff the same way anymore. Okay, enough of my nostalgia babble, I happen to be just thinking out loud. Back in the 80s, cartoons kept it simple and were mostly about selling toys and saving the world, mostly before breakfast. But BraveStarr tried to aim higher, and while it did not last long as Masters of the Universe, it still deserves our attention. So, are we ready to jump into this pool of nostalgia? Because it's about time.
But I wouldn't stand so close if I were you.
Why not?
Why BraveStarr was different from other 1980s cartoons. It was the year 1987, and Filmation Studios was riding high on the He-Man wave. They already had iconic shows like He-Man and the Masters of the Universe, and She-Ra, Princess of Power, to their name. It had built its name through fantasy, action, and left children with moral lessons near the end of the episode. While it may not score points with the characters, which were a little too stiff, but they certainly earned their brownie points when they told kids how to be decent human beings. It seemed Filmation had cracked the 80s cartoon formula, and all they had to do was make the cartoon, fill the racks with its merchandise, and print money. BraveStarr came near the end of that era, but producers Lou Scheimer and Norm Prescott did not want BraveStarr to be just another rinse and repeat copy of He-Man. So they went hunting, and the inspiration came from Filmation's own live-action Ghostbusters series from the 70s, and asked themselves, what if the Wild West moved to space? And that's how BraveStarr came to be. So back in 1987, when Filmation announced BraveStarr, a lot of people didn't really know what to think of it. Since Filmation gave us He-Man and She-Ra, people naturally expected a larger-than-life hero who would now look directly at the camera to deliver the moral lines. But BraveStarr did it differently. Instead, the series gave us New Texas, an alien planet and one of the most bizarre but memorable worlds to come out of any cartoon show. Why bizarre, you ask? Well, the saloons were very close to spaceports. Criminals rode hover horses instead of real horses, where cacti were aliens and prairie dogs were actually beings that could talk. It was like the Wild Wild West, but only with laser pistols, robot deputies, and talking horses that could walk on there too. Basically, a Clint Eastwood world with a little mix of Star Wars which talks about ethics. The series aired in syndication from September 1987 to February 1988 with 65 episodes, and was set in the 23rd century on an alien planet called New Texas. It was a mining colony where settlers dug up cerium, a rare mineral that worked like space gold. It was valuable, dangerous, and so obviously every criminal on the planet wanted a piece of it. And in the midst of it all stood one of the most underrated heroes of the 80s, Marshal BraveStarr. BraveStarr, with that very fancy capital S in the middle and the double R at the end, was a galactic lone native lawman with a laser pistol and the power to invoke animal spirits. And these powers were far from subtle. Every time he called on one of these powers, it was a total moment where the screen would flash, the show would literally stop, and BraveStarr would strike a pose and announce the power he was using. As a kid, it was a treat to watch that. Whenever BraveStarr needed speed, he would call upon the speed of the puma. Whenever he needed absolute strength, he used strength of the bear. With eyes of the hawk came supervision, and ears of the wolf gave him ultra-sharp ears. But, in spite of being so powerful, BraveStarr was never the one to approach a situation with violence. He was always thoughtful and spiritual, and that trait came from being raised by a shaman who taught him to respect life and use his powers with care. For an 80s action cartoon with robots and hoverbikes, that was rich. These weren't the only things that made BraveStarr different. He was one of the first indigenous heroes to lead a mainstream American animated series, and that was a big deal at the time it came out. BraveStarr was guided and trained by the shaman, a Native American spiritual mentor. And for an 80s cartoon, that was something rare and totally fresh. While most cartoons were all swords and armour, BraveStarr had spiritual power and a minority running in the forefront. And since we are talking of all things atypical in the cartoon, BraveStarr also gave us Doc Clayton, an African American doctor in Fort Kerium. And that was way before Doc McStuffins became such a major children's character. BraveStarr set out to do something never done before, and well, they tried with all honesty. That's way more diversity than we saw on Friends. Oh, my bad. I do not mean to ruffle feathers here. While talking about the Native American elements of the hero, Arthur Nadell, the Vice President of Creative Affairs at the studio, said the idea came from indigenous people being being closest to the Earth and allowed them to explore an element of mysticism. So yes, it was certainly a bold choice. However, by current standards, it may look problematic and generalized. But there is no denying that BraveStarr set out to be unusual for an American action cartoon in the 80s. BraveStarr's main partner and ride was 3030, a robotic horse that was so much fun. Add Grumpy to it, 3030 was a robot horse who could run on 4 legs, talk, well, argue, and stand on his 2 legs and fire a huge shotgun named Sarah Jane, and he still had the time to complain about the state of the universe. Although he wasn't meant to be a comic relief, he was so good at it. He had too much temper for a horse, had an ego the size of a mountain, and had a moral code quite different from a horse. He was treated as a person in the show who showed anger and exasperation every chance he got. There are scenes where he and BraveStarr argue over opposing views on using force and restraint, which means you see a lawman and a robot horse debate violence. If that's something that doesn't pull you to watch the show, you are missing a lot, my friend. Today, we talk about robots and self-driving cars, but BraveStarr gave us an equestroid, a robot horse that could shift into a humanoid form and carry weapons decades ago. I mean, we took 40 years to catch up with a cartoon horse, which is frankly a little embarrassing. Now we already know that New Texas ran on the very valuable red crystal Cerium that powered weapons and the whole city. This naturally made it something everyone wanted. People mined it, while the thieves left no opportunity to steal it. Every crime on the planet revolved around it. And if you see BraveStarr, which came out in the 80s, it kinda shows a mirror of the society we live in. Swap Cerium with oil or a rare earth metal that's gonna make them rich, and suddenly everyone acts like a villain who wants the rare item solely for themselves. This made BraveStarr ahead of its time, as it taught kids about greed, control, corruption, and the power and balance of the world we call our own. The main settlement was Fort Cerium, and when BraveStarr saved Fort Cerium, he went against a system with no morals that made everyone chase the same damn red rock. And that's what BraveStarr did best. It asked big questions hidden in a space cowboy adventure, and whether there is power to exploit, there has to be a villain to exploit it. And that is where Tex Hex makes his appearance. With purple withered skin, Tex Hex looked like Skeletor if Skeletor was played by Lee Van Cleef. And that's a fantastic look, I admit. But Tex Hex wasn't always the villain we know him as. Before Tex Hex became the purple ruthless outlaw, ghoul of New Texas, he was just plain old Tex. Tex and his friend McBride came to New Texas when they heard of Cerium's endless supply. All Tex wanted was enough Cerium so that he could return to his home planet and build a house and marry his girlfriend Ursula. Pretty harmless, right? But then Tex grew greedy. He made a deal with Scuzz, another outlaw, and they planned to enslave the native prairie people to mine Cerium for them. From being a man who came looking for prospects to better his life, Tex had crossed to the other side of the line. He betrayed McBride and took all the Cerium for himself and left McBride to die. However, the gods above had a completely different plan. As Tex and Scuzz prepared to leave, their ship went down and both were killed. But Tex was revived by an ancient demon named Stampede, who made Tex his servant. He gave Tex a new name, Tex Hex, and granted him powers and turned him into the undead outlaw we know from the series. Even death did not teach Tex a lesson on greed, because he went on to recruit the worst of the worst and named his gang of outlaws the Carrion Bunch. No wonder BraveStarr had to be the planet's galactic marshal, because once the undead leader, Tex Hex, and BraveStarr crossed paths, their rivalry became the engine that drove the series. Tex Hex tried every trick in his book to get his hands on the Cerium while trying to push Stampede's plan into motion, but BraveStarr and his allies were always there to push back. Tex was undoubtedly a villain, but a villain ahead of its time. I say this because he wasn't black or white and straight up villainous. At times, he would regret and spend almost all his time moaning about his old life. After all, he had an ex-girlfriend he left behind. But to be fair, Mr. sold his soul to the ultra evil boss of evil bosses, all because he was greedy and wanted more Cerium and power. So maybe just stop. I mean, we never saw Mum-Ra sit around the pyramid and cry over his ex, or Skeletor spending his time on self-reflections. But if you really see the character of Tex Hex up close, he gives us a glimpse of the modern world. Underneath all that corruption still lived a person who left home to build a new life for himself, only to end up falling into the pit of greed and making bad choice after bad choice. Through him, the show spoke about how the hunt for wealth can damage people and entire communities. It asked uncomfortable questions about what really happens when you sell your soul to the devil. Again, this was a cartoon meant to sell plastic horses with guns. And yet here it was, talking about heavy topics like greed and addiction. In my opinion, BraveStarr did a lot for a kids cartoon. Another interesting fact is that Tex Hex was created before before BraveStarr itself. The series was built around its antagonist rather than the other way around. Remember, I told you earlier Scheimer and Prescott went content hunting. Well, the Tex Hex story started long ago. The character of Tex Hex was designed in 1984 during the development of Filmation's Ghostbusters cartoon. Scheimer took a strong liking to the character and hence decided to pull him out of that project and build a sci-fi cartoon around him. But BraveStarr was not only about cool villains and a talking horse, it posed some really pinching questions about greed and humans and the future we were building. And that brings me to one of the most controversial and heartbreaking episodes any cartoon has ever explored. We have seen ample cartoons policing kids to do their homework or respect elders, but the episode The Price from BraveStarr really unsettled me. And it wasn't only me, as this episode still shocked so many people out there because BraveStarr did what most kids shows of the time would have avoided. It talked about drugs and addiction, and well, death. The story follows a young boy named Jay who takes a drug named Spin, which was sold by Hex's gang. Jay got hooked on it fast and collapsed on the streets in front of everyone. And if you were waiting for a happy ending here, let me just break it to you that Jay dies of an overdose. And for a kids' cartoon show, that was a little too much. First the addiction, then the death. It was all suddenly too grim. In a way, it taught kids that every action, good and bad, has real consequences. Sometimes it can even end a life. I mean, the writers obviously weren't out to traumatize the kids, but definitely wanted to jolt them awake. The 80s were a time when America was deep in substance abuse, and you could say that it was a respectful attempt and treated kids as people and not merely consumers. If you really think about it, this hits a little too close to home. Replace drugs with vapes, pills, screen, or endless loops of dopamine, and you've got yourself an addiction. This wasn't something you would expect a kids' cartoon show to do. When did those become so serious, right? But that's the reason The Price remains one of the rawest and rarest episodes to come out of a kids' cartoon. With the episode, BraveStarr broke the unspoken rule of kids-safe cartoon, and while the show didn't last long, the said episode certainly left quite an impression. The show even explored the environmental themes, and in a space show, that's quite a stretch. And somehow BraveStarr pulled it off. You see, New Texas was not a lush paradise. It was dry, harsh, and full of mines. Every hill and every path seems to lead back to Kirium. We know Kirium was in demand among outlaws and criminals, but the fact that went unnoticed was that it was the land that had to bear the brunt of everyone's greed. Episode after episode, BraveStarr fought people who just wanted to overmine and tear the planet apart for their own profit. The show talked about respect and care for the land long before it became a concern for the modern world. In the show, BraveStarr says, "The planet gives you what it can, but not forever," which is so true and hard-hitting in the times we live in. While there's no lack of adventures in the show, BraveStarr wrapped its messages under the guise of fun adventures and asked uneasy questions on addiction, environmental collapse, and corporate greed. BraveStarr had all of it in a children's cartoon and then some more. In terms of technical innovation, Filmation was making strides with BraveStarr. This studio used 3 animation techniques at the same time. They were traditional hand-drawn animation, rotoscope work, and CGI. Now when I say CGI, I do not mean Pixar level obviously, but Filmation used computer-generated imagery for vehicles and buildings and other complex elements. The rotoscope made the characters' motion more realistic. They filmed live actors, traced over the footage, and used that as a base. This made action scenes smoother and more dynamic than many Saturday cartoons had at the time. Filmation was trying to reach the skies on a television budget, and they somewhat achieved it. Was BraveStarr based on a toy line? But you see, all this world building and all this visual ambition still had one main business goal, and that was to sell toys. I mean, let's not take the moral high ground here and get too emotional. This was the 80s. Almost half of the decade was a toy commercial. BraveStarr was no different. However, that's not the whole truth. Well, it's true that the BraveStarr toy line was made by Mattel, and the figures reached stores in 1986, while the cartoon aired in 1987. So it's natural to assume that the cartoon came later to sell the toys. But that's not the whole story. This was not the same as the He-Man case where Mattel already had the Masters of the Universe toys, and Filmation then built a world around it to sell the toys. With BraveStarr, Filmation had the idea first. The studio had worked out the futuristic vibe of the show with the lawman with mystic powers and a planet of outlaws, robot horses, and minerals. And before the world came to be known as New Texas, it was New Cheyenne. So Filmation had done its homework with this one. Scheimer took the total package to Mattel, and Mattel of course saw the toy potential right away. I mean, who wouldn't like a cowboy with animal powers and a sidekick partner who was a robot horse that could shoot giant guns? Mattel liked the concept because they were already looking, okay fine, searching for space fantasy ideas, and BraveStarr literally fell on their lap. And these weren't tiny little figures either. Mattel seemed to go all out because BraveStarr was huge for the time. They were close to 8 inches tall, and they came with action features, accessories, and Kirium nuggets. Mattel even changed the colour of BraveStarr's outfit to make it work better as boys' toys, and thus BraveStarr's golden costume changed to a yellow shirt, mustard trousers, with a blue vest and blue and brown boots. However, the toy did more harm than it did good for BraveStarr. Mattel wanted the Christmas season, and thus the toys came out before the cartoon, which ultimately proved fatal for the cartoon. Kids were introduced to the figures even before they knew who BraveStarr was. Without the show, the toy did not have the same emotional pull as He-Man, and while they looked cool, it bombed at the market. By the time BraveStarr reached the screens in 1987, the buzz around the toys had died down. Pat Fraley, who was the voice of Marshall BraveStarr, called the series the most creative endeavour Filmation ever attempted. He went on to add that it should have done better because there was a huge toy distribution problem. He also said, "We did 65 of them, and then it went away."
Strength of the bear, the bear, the bear.
The final broadcast episode, Strength of the Bear. The final episode of BraveStarr gave Marshall BraveStarr one last personal test, and if I'm being honest here, this was a pretty fitting way to close the show. The episode began with BraveStarr and 3030 on their way back to town when a rock slide trapped a poor miner inside a cave. The miner yelled for help, so naturally, BraveStarr walked up to the boulder and called for the strength of the bear. We had seen what happened when BraveStarr invoked his power, animals, and this was no different. Surprisingly, nothing happened. While the duo managed to help the miner out of the cave, a completely bewildered BraveStarr made his way to the shaman. There he learnt that he had reached a time where he must renew his bond with the animal spirits. In order to do that, BraveStarr had to go into the wilderness without weapons or powers. And although BraveStarr was a lawman, let's not forget this was New Texas. The planet was filled with criminals, outlaws, and armed maniacs. Courage and intelligence sound good, but if I were BraveStarr, I would still like to keep my weapon. Anywho, BraveStarr was BraveStarr after all, and so he goes ahead. I mean, the episode poses a fascinating question of who really was BraveStarr if he was stripped of his weapons and powers that somewhere made him the protector of the planet. He might have complained a bit, which is fair enough, but at the end of the day, BraveStarr, even without all his weapons and powers, was still the same BraveStarr because he still chose the hard path. Because he wanted to earn back his powers the right way. Obviously, when the villains learnt about BraveStarr's fragile state, Stampede sent others to make BraveStarr's quest difficult. At one point, BraveStarr was captured by Stampede's men. But soon, 3030 along with others came to BraveStarr's aid. Ultimately, he gets his powers back when he calls upon the strength of the bear to save someone else. And just like that, BraveStarr's powers were once again back. He did not get the powers back because he wanted them. Instead, BraveStarr got them back when he used his courage for someone else and put himself in harm's way. As the last episode of the show, the storyline makes sense because, right from the beginning, BraveStarr was built around the idea that power needs character behind it. The animal powers were undoubtedly super cool, but the show always centered on BraveStarr's moral compass and his duty to protect others, so the finale kinda slaps. Interestingly, the finale episode, Strength of the Bear, was not written as a grand finale for the whole BraveStarr story. If you ask me how BraveStarr ended in a story sense, I have to be very honest. Yes, it did not resolve the main conflict of Tex Hex or Stampede at all, so why didn't we get a Tex Hex closure? I mean, the guy was right there from the start to make BraveStarr's life difficult. I mean, Tex Hex, as a character in itself, was too important to vanish with one final note, but there was a practical reason behind it all. BraveStarr was a syndicated 1980s cartoon with 65 episodes. The episodes were unrelated to each other, with every episode dragging a new problem that BraveStarr had to deal with. Sometimes it was addiction, other times it was greed or prejudice, so naturally this made it easier for kids to drop in any time without worrying that they missed out on a big side plot. The show wasn't structured like most modern series are. The new episode didn't continue with the previous storyline, and there was no final villain that the show marched toward. Tex Hex would cause trouble on Monday, Stampede could scheme on Tuesday, 3030 could threaten to reduce half the Badlands to barbecue on Wednesday, and by Thursday, the world will be back to its normal self. While I understand what was going on, it does not mean that the final episode does not feel awkward, because when Stampede remained undefeated, Tex Hex was still very much on the loose, and the whole Carrion Bunch problem continued to exist. The finale does not really feel like a finale. Another way to look at it would be that the villains were never really that important, although the whole world came alive only after Tex Hex was breathed life into. I mean, the main conflict wasn't the villains here, it was a hero finale. I mean, sure, the show used Stampede and Tex Hex as the outside threat, but the real conflict was always BraveStarr versus fear, doubt, and dependency on power. And once he proved that even without his powers, he had the courage to do the right thing, the show had done its job. It's philosophical if you see. However, that does not mean I don't wish for one last riot by Tex Hex in the final episode. The man totally earned a last dramatic rant, at the very least. But it was a different kind of closure the show was looking for, as BraveStarr simply keeps riding on.
Of New Texas.
Was BraveStarr cancelled or properly ended? People often say BraveStarr was cancelled after one season, and in casual terms, it's somewhat correct. The show came out in 1987, and right about that time, there was a shift in the TV scene. Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles kind of ruled the screens, and kids wanted mutant heroes and larger-than-life adventures. And a Spaceboy Lawman show which dealt with heavy themes did not check those boxes, because even after all its creativity, BraveStarr never really became the giant hit Filmation needed. Even the toy line did not manage to grab the attention as Filmation had hoped for, and that was a huge problem because the whole project was heavily tied to the toy market. The BraveStarr movie came out in 1988, but it did poor business, and not long after, Filmation shut down. But having said that, I would also like to add that the show didn't fail because it lacked ideas. I mean, the show taught kids ethics and empathy, and still did not skimp on giving spaceships and laser horses. BraveStarr didn't fail because it was bad. It failed because it was futuristic and ahead of its time, and we were not yet ready to have those conversations.
Interference. That's right, 3030. The shaman said the spirits would provide.
What happened to the voice cast after BraveStarr? After BraveStarr ended in 1988, the show faded way too fast. However, what did not vanish into the new Texas dust was the voice cast. When the show ended, Filmation was on the verge of the road and the toy line had already been replaced with something cooler. However, the voice cast moved on to other projects. Pat Fraley was the voice behind Marshall BraveStarr, who gave him the calm, good guy voice. He had the voice that might even talk down a criminal from committing his next crime and then go on to teach a moral lesson to the kids. Such an impressive voice it was. After BraveStarr ended, Fraley went on to become one of the voices that was everywhere. He voiced Krang in the original Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles cartoon, and also voiced Casey Jones and Baxter Stockman in that same TMNT series. Fraley then returned to cartoons with Marshall Moo Montana in Wild West Cowboys of Moo Mesa. He also became a secondary Buzz Lightyear voice in Toy Story games, storybooks, toys, and theme park media. So whenever Tim Allen was not there, Fraley helped fill his shoes and kept Buzz alive. Later, Fraley shifted towards teaching and ran voiceover workshops and trained actors. Charlie Adler, who voiced both Deputy Fuzz and Tex Hex, went on to voice Buster Bunny in Tiny Toon Adventures. He voiced both Cow and Chicken in the Cow and Chicken show, as well as the Red Guy. He even voiced Starscream in Michael Bay's Transformers films. So Adler was pretty busy post BraveStarr, but Adler's career didn't stay behind the mic. He also directed various cartoon shows like The Rugrats, The Wild Thornberrys, Rocket Power, All Grown Up, The Replacements, and The Marvelous Misadventures of Flapjack. Adler also voiced Dr. Peacock, the evil scientist in the Fruit Loops commercials. Susan Blue, who voiced Judge J.B. McBride, is already a famous name among animation fans as RC, who is one of the most recognised female Autobots from the Transformers franchise. She also voiced Transmutate in Beast Wars and later worked as voice director on Beast Wars and Beast Machines. She also worked on Magic School Bus, Men in Black the series, Transformers Animated, and the 2003 Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles revival. Also Ed Gilbert voiced 3030 and the Shaman. From a talking horse who fired a gun to a spiritual guide, I mean what a range. He also voiced General Hawk in G.I. Joe, Mandarin in the 1990s Iron Man cartoon, Fazir in Aladdin, Mr. Shmee in Peter Pan and the Pirates, and Dormammu in Spider-Man the Animated Series. So if you watch 90s cartoons, Ed Gilbert was almost all over the place. Sadly, Gilbert died from lung cancer in 1999 at the age of 67. Alan Oppenheimer voiced Stampede, but Filmation's fans already knew him as the voice behind Skeletor, Man-at-Arms, and others. Outside of animation, Oppenheimer also played Koroth in Star Trek The Next Generation, and appeared in Deep Space Nine and Voyager, what came after the final episode. BraveStarr the movie. BraveStarr the movie is the only place where we see the start of BraveStarr's life, because when we met BraveStarr in the series, he was already the Marshal of New Texas. So right at the start of the movie, we see baby BraveStarr asleep in a stasis chamber aboard a spaceship that is about to land on New Texas. The man standing beside the chamber, a Native American, talks about the boy's destiny, and he clearly knew that this child was meant for a very different life. The whole vibe is a very close nod to Superman, so the child is sent away to survive with the hope that the Galactic Marshals will find him. The larger ships go down in New Texas, but the man survives long enough to stand against the evil force that caused the attack, and that was none other than Stampede. Stampede 2 has reached New Texas and begins his search for someone who would carry out his evil intentions. That turns out to be Tex. Tex was already a cruel man even before he had met Stampede, so Stampede finds him and transforms Tex into Tex Hex. Meanwhile, word gets out in New Texas that there was a crystal called Kyrium which had the magical powers to heal and fuel the whole planet. And once the galaxy learns about it, it descends into madness. The movie compares this rush of greed to the old gold rush in Western North America. And why would Tex Hex stay behind? He recruits the worst people he can find, and together they terrorize the towns of New Texas. People finally turn towards Galactic Marshals and ask for help, but in return, all they get is one man, BraveStarr. and a female judge named JB. The people of the town are exactly not thrilled with the tiny squad, but BraveStarr proves himself in no time. In his very first clash with Tex Hex, he displays surprising strength, and while the whole encounter does not go perfectly, it was enough to prove BraveStarr's worth. BraveStarr later finds the shaman, his old mentor in the desert, and through him, he learns about his own people. They happen to be a group of Native Americans who had moved to another world only to flee after Stampede appeared. Now Stampede was in New Texas, so basically the threat had followed BraveStarr here. The shaman then sent BraveStarr to find the ultimate weapon that would help him to fight Stampede. By now, BraveStarr already had the strength of the bear, eyes of the hawk, ears of the wolf, and speed of the puma. While BraveStarr was in search of the weapon, he met 3030, the robot horse, and together they helped fight off Tex Hex's next attack on the town. BraveStarr had finally won the trust of the locals, although BraveStarr knew Tex Hex was far from being done. And surely he does. Tex plans a much larger attack with his Legion of Evil, and now BraveStarr needs the whole town to present a united front. That meant humans and prairie people alike. The movie uses the conflict to make a moral point that New Texas cannot survive if the people who live there stay divided, and Tex Hex and Stampede will never stop threatening the planet. Now as a film, you can tell that Filmation had high hopes for the world of BraveStarr. To their credit, the film looked better than the average Filmation TV product. Effort was put into the special effects. Back before computer-assisted post-production became the new normal, many of these shots had to pass under the camera 7 or 8 times. It was tedious and a lot of work, but they did anyway, and this is why the film might be one of the best looking things Filmation ever made. By no means was this a perfect movie, the editing was choppy, but compared to Filmation's Pinocchio and The Emperor of the Night, BraveStarr the movie looked more realistic and attractive than you might expect. The critics said the movie boasts some impressive computer-generated special effects, and the computer animators did their job almost too well. The movie was set before the television series, so it worked as BraveStarr's origin story, and can certainly be called a prequel, but it came out after the TV series had already ended. The final episode of the show, Strength of the Bear, aired on February 24th, 1988, while the film reached North American markets on March 18th, 1988. In North America, it was called BraveStarr the Movie. In Europe, it was sold as BraveStarr the Legend. In the Philippines, it also had the title The Legend of BraveStarr. The film ran for 91 minutes and was released by Taurus Entertainment. It was directed by Tom Tataranowics, written by Bob Forward and Steve Hayes, produced by Lou Scheimer, and the music came from Frank W. Becker. Video games. BraveStarr also had a video game to its name, which was released from late 1987 to early 1988 on the Amstrad CPC, Sinclair ZX Spectrum, and Commodore 64. Here, the player took control of our lawman, who was armed with a laser gun, and his big mission was to save New Texas from Stampede and Tex Hex. So, you know, the usual. You run, you jump, and you shoot enemies. You collect information from people and places so you can find Shaman before time runs out. Because if BraveStarr failed to rescue Shaman in time, Stampede wins, and the player has to start over. Not so deep, but absolutely fun. Comics. BraveStarr did have comics, and the stories were beyond the TV episodes. However, if you're looking for an answer to the question of whether the comics continue the story after the last episode, and finally give us the long-awaited Tex Hex and Stampede closure, I'm sorry to disappoint you guys, because that did not happen in the comics as well. The main US comic version came from Blackthorn Publishing, and was called BraveStarr in 3D. Now don't ask me why, they put out merely 2 issues with 32 pages each and called it a day. The first issue was called The Legend of BraveStarr. It had BraveStarr, 3030, and JB against Tex Hex and his mutant outlaws. The second was called A Boy and His Horse, and explored how BraveStarr and 3030 met, fought, and became the odd best friends. BraveStarr comics were also released in the UK by Ladybird. It was written by Ian Alexander and illustrated by Robin Davies. It had 4 issues, and the first comic, titled The Phantom Herd, came out in 1987 and had 28 pages. It followed BraveStarr, who had just returned to New Texas after a vacation, while Tex Hex was building a herd of longhornosaurs, basically dinosaur cattle, to help him take over New Texas. The second comic also had 28 pages and was called The Tail Drive. Here, Tex Hex has put on a disguise as an attorney named Hiram K. Hornswoggle III. As usual, Tex Hex is up to no good and claims to own land that the prairie people need. He even stole their robo-cows, and BraveStarr finally had to step in to recover the stolen cattle. The third comic was The Rodeo, and this one focused on Marshal BraveStarr and his horse as they compete in a rodeo. The fourth book was called The Great Kyrium Robbery, and as the title says, this one has BraveStarr dealing with criminals who try to steal as much Kyrium as possible. While the comics did give fans a new leash on the whole BraveStarr franchise, they are in no way a sequel to the cartoon. Spin-off. A spin-off to BraveStarr was initially planned. However, it never got off the ground. The spin-off titled Bravo, The Quest of the Prairie People was still in development when Filmation shut down. Only one episode was fully animated, and that episode was called Fun with the Fuzzy Folk. It never aired on television, which is a damn shame, because it would have focused on the prairie people from New Texas. However, the episode finally surfaced in 2007 as a bonus feature on BraveStarr DVDs. Who owns BraveStarr now, and could it return? Once Filmation shut down, it eventually became part of Classic Media. Then in 2012, DreamWorks Animation bought Classic Media. In 2016, NBC Universal bought DreamWorks Animation. So basically, long story short, BraveStarr is DreamWorks Animation's property, which happened to give us Shrek, Kung Fu Panda, The Boss Baby, How to Train Your Dragon, among many others. While the screen rights of BraveStarr belong to DreamWorks Animation, Mattel filed a US trademark application for BraveStarr in 2020 for toys, games, action figures, and alike. And so for a revival, the screen rights holders, toy partner, and brand team need to be on the same page, and that's a lot. So if we ever even think that BraveStarr could actually make a return, all the stars need to align to make the miracle true. And even if by some magic BraveStarr did return, it was a long road ahead of itself. Now BraveStarr was a famous cartoon, but it wasn't as big as He-Man or the Transformers. And this means it has to find a new set of audience because it cannot run alone on nostalgia. Second, and the most important issue, would be the Native American factor, which would need a little more care in its treatment. I mean, people now have way less tolerance than they did in the 80s. So the native identity, the shaman, would need a proper modern handling. And lastly, the rights and brand value should make business sense. NBC Universal owns DreamWorks and has many brands already. On the other hand, Mattel owned the toy line rights. That's gotta confuse anybody. However, these are all pipe dreams as there is no news of a new BraveStarr movie, series, or official continuation. The fans hope, and plenty on the internet say, that BraveStarr deserves another shot, but as of now, there is no official chatter in town. So that's it from my side today. If this trip back to New Texas made you smile, hit like, subscribe to the channel because it really helps in keeping these forgotten stories alive. Also, tell me in the comments which BraveStarr episode you remember most. Was it Strength of the Bear, The Price, the movie, or are you here mainly because you are a 30/30 fan? Because high five! I'll see you in the next one, have a great day.